In this courseware video, we will build upon what we learned in the tracking introductory video to perform advanced stabilization and to replace the sign using four-corner tracking techniques. As usual, we start with a new composition, then open the frame format preferences and set the default format to NTSC D1. This will match our footage. Click on the Save button to close the dialog. Then switch to a file browser, locate the courseware footage folder, open the sign folder, and drag the sign JPEG sequence you find in there into the flow. Right-click in an empty area of the flow and select Force All Tile Pictures. Then display the loader in the view and hit the Fit button to make sure that it fits in the view. We'll also right-click and set the render range to the length of the loader. That's 87 frames, so we'll type 87 in the global end as well. Add a tracker tool to the flow by clicking and dragging the tracker toolbar button into the display view, which will connect the tracker to our loader and ensure that it is viewed. We already have one tracker pattern which we'll place on the first corner of the sign. Locate the Add button in the tracker tool's controls and click on it 3 more times in order to add 3 additional tracker patterns. Then position those patterns on the corners of the sign that we find in the foreground of the image. The top 2 points can be a little smaller. The pattern doesn't need to be quite so big, and that will make the track happen a little bit faster, so we just want to grab the corners there. Now in the case of the third pattern, we're actually going to make that larger, in full knowledge that this will make the track fail for that point. However, we're going to use that as a demonstration later on. Once you've selected all 4 of the points, locate the Track Forward button and click to start the track. Now the track's going to be a little slower than it was previously because now we're tracking 4 different patterns and one of them is quite large. As we approach about the middle of the track, we start to see the sign in the background crossing over top of the pattern that we have. I'm expecting that the tracking pattern will now start to get confused, and surely it has. Our track is complete, so let's click on the All Trackers button, scroll down in the view, and we can see the patterns for all 4 of the tracker patterns. Play back the flipbook for Tracker 3, and you can find the frame, which seems to be about frame 64, where we start to go off the track. Change frames to frame 60, then scroll up in the controls and turn off the checkboxes for trackers 1, 2, and 4. This tells the tracker we won't be retracking those patterns, but that we are not disabling them. If we were to clear the checkbox entirely, then Fusion would not even include the tracker in calculations for stabilization and corner positioning, so make sure not to do that. Now we've set our controls so that trackers 1, 2, and 4 won't be affected when we retrack tracker 3. Zoom in a little bit on the image. Now we could just change the size of the pattern here so that it would be valid again and then track forward. But let's pretend that the pattern has either become invalid or gone off the side of the frame and we need to acquire from a new pattern. So what we'll do is we'll change to Track Center Append mode instead of Pattern Center. Now when we click and drag, we select a new pattern, but as Fusion tracks that pattern, it will replace the pattern that was previously there. So it appends to the existing pattern instead of jumping to the new pattern position. So Track Center Append is excellent for dealing with pattern points that have gone off the edges of the frame. Now that we have 4 solid patterns, we are ready to get started. Set the composition to high quality. The footage we are working with is pretty small and we don't need to worry as much about the render times. Let's use the 4 points on the corners that we have tracked to perform a sign replacement. Locate the courseware footage stills folder, then click and drag the Eyeon splash bitmap into the flow. View the loader in one of the display views, and you'll see the splash screen that appears when Fusion 5 starts. Select the loader's import tab and make the alpha channel solid. We won't be needing the transparency for this purpose. Now connect the logo to the tracker's foreground input and set the operation mode of the tracker to corner position. Press play and you can see how the 4 corners of the logo have been mapped to the 4 patterns and the result has been merged together. This is a fast and very simple way to do sign replacement. Although the tracker defaults to merging the sign replacement over the background, you can always select the foreground only option in the operation. Foreground over background works fine for us here though, so switch back. Your points may not line up exactly with the corners of the sign. Each pattern provides an offset control that can be used to tweak the position it produces slightly. Switch to the Trackers tab, then change from All Trackers to Selected Trackers Details. Now you will see the offset for the X and the Y axes for whichever tracker is currently selected. So for example, to change Tracker 1's offset, we would select Tracker 1 in the list, and then we would simply drag on the sliders to tweak or adjust the position or the offset. Another trick would be to select the Tracker tool and then click on the Position or Offset button in the Display View toolbar. And this allows us to click directly in the view and drag to position the offsets for each of the four corners. So we'll just set that into the four corners so it's nice and tight. And that concludes that. Set the view to fit again, deselect the tracker, then hit play just to see our sign replacement one more time. So now that we have completed our sign replacement, we want to use the same tracking data to stabilize our rather shaky shot. Copy the tracker tool by right-clicking and selecting Copy from the context menu, then right-click in the flow and select Paste to paste a second copy. This will get all of the tracked paths we originally created. Connect the output of the first tracker to the second tracker. Then switch to the Operation tab and change from Corner Positioning to Match Move and set the value to Background Only. Then view that in the Display View. Return to frame 0 and press Play to see the effect on our image. You can see that we're stabilizing the image so that it returns always to the first frame where we initially selected our patterns. Stop the playback and open the Match Move Settings control. This determines where the reference frame is for our stabilization. If we have Start selected, as we do by default, then we stabilize to the start frame in our tracked range. If we select on End, then instead we will stabilize so that we're always moving towards a stable final position at the end of the track. However, an interesting mode is Start and End, which will now cause Fusion to interpolate between the start point and the end point. This will generate a smooth camera movement, getting rid of a lot of the jitter or shakiness that was in the original shot. The best way to evaluate the difference between the stabilized version of the shot and the original version is to click in the view and then turn on the A-B split view. This will cause this view to be separated into an A buffer and a B buffer. We can drag the original into the B side, deselect the tracker to eliminate its controls, then click on the edge of the A-B split wipe bar and rotate it until it's horizontal and position it so that you can see half of the sign that's been stabilized and replaced and half of the original loader. Then click on Play. On the bottom we can see the original and on the top we see the stabilized result. Clearly we have a much smoother result on the top. Go ahead and stop playback and then change back to frame 0. We no longer need the contents of the B buffer, so switch back to the A view in order to disable the A-B split wipe and view the results of our second tracker. There are 4 patterns in our tracker, so Fusion is able to calculate not just position, but also rotation and scaling. In this case, scaling isn't necessary, so deselect the scaling checkbox. Press play again to view our stabilization. Now, the stabilization is a little bit at an angle because of where we first selected our frame. We've also been losing a little bit off the edges as it makes transformations to stabilize the shot. What we want to do is add a transformation tool after our second tracker. So drag an XF or a transform tool into the flow and connect it to the output of the last tracker. Then view it in the display view and drag the size control up slightly so that we're no longer losing anything off the edges. We'll also rotate the view just a little bit so that we straighten out the sign. Now we'll just jump through a couple of frames just to make sure that this covers all of the situations we might be looking at. Now you may know that each transformation which is applied to an image can make it a bit softer, as subpixel positioning takes its toll on the image. Our composition does 3 transformations. The first tracker is a transform tool, and it's adding the splash screen into our shot. The second tracker stabilizes the image, which is also a transformation. And then we apply a third transform using a transform tool to adjust the scale. That's 3 transformations. Fortunately, Fusion is designed to minimize the impact by concatenating adjacent transforms. The best way to picture a concatenated transform is to imagine that the transform tools are lazy. They don't want to do any work. So they look downstream to see if they might be connected to another transform tool. If they are, then they won't render an image at all. Instead, they will pass the details of the transformation to the next tool. That tool then adds its own transformation and looks downstream to see if it might be connected to another transform. If it is, it passes the results of both transformations onwards. Eventually, the tool can't pass the buck forward anymore, and one of the tools has to render the transformation to an image. This is known as flattening the transform. So even though we used 3 transformation tools, we've really only processed the image once. This means we maintained the highest possible quality. And that concludes our second tracking courseware video.